Hi everyone, my name is Ricardo, and today I'll be describing two projects that I've been working on where we develop deep learning algorithms to make a specific prediction about MRI data. So before we get into the specifics of the projects, I wanted to just introduce some concepts about deep learning to give you a sense for the type of work that we do. So deep learning, we can think of it as a subfield of machine learning, which in itself is a subfield of artificial intelligence. And AI is the general concept of trying to mimic human intelligence. So then in machine learning, what we try to do is to develop an algorithm that can make an internal representation of your input data and then make a prediction about something in the future. So the algorithm is learning if the prediction errors is getting reduced. So machine learning is very powerful and can be used for detecting spam emails or for detecting objects in an image. So for example, let's say you're interested in detecting this stop sign. The programmer might identify some features that they'll combine in the end. So for example, one of the features might be the letter S, or the color red could be very useful, or the octagon shape. And at the end of the day, what the algorithm does is it'll combine these different features and then make a prediction saying, yes, this is a stop sign, or no, this is a picture of my mom. So then in machine learning, what people did is they introduced additional layers to increase the complexity of the algorithm. So here I'm showing just a very similar architecture, but we have an additional layer here, layer 2. And with this additional layer, what we can do is then take the input and combine them in different ways, and then in the second layer, we then combine it again in a different way. So this increases the level of sophistication, the complexity of the algorithm. And that's what deep learning did, is they built on this concept of adding layers. And so they added more and more layers, and then you get this deep learning. So this is one example of deep learning, of an architecture that's used in deep learning. This is called the AlexNet. And you can see it's very complex. It has a lot of layers. And this is a convolutional neural network. So some of the key features of this architecture is that it uses convolution, max pooling, and a rectify linear unit. So with these three mathematical procedures or processes, this architecture was developed to very accurately detect the content of images with very high accuracy. So another key difference between deep learning and machine learning is that the architectures are very complex. This specific architecture is made up of 1 million parameters, and so you need a lot of data to train it well. So typically you want tens of thousands of samples or hundreds of thousands of samples in order to properly train it. And this is where we come into neuroscience. So recently in neuroscience, there's been a trend of these neuroimaging databases emerging where people are trying to increase the power of the study by acquiring more and more data to study a specific disease or study the human brain. So these neuroimaging databases are acquiring lots and lots of data. They have up to tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of data sets of brain imaging. And so this is exactly what we did in the first project. We developed a deep learning algorithm to do something very simple, which is to detect the contrast of an MRI data set. So this work is in collaboration with NeuroX and was published in Neuroinformatics last year. So NeuroX is a company that's contracted by pharmaceutical companies to process the MRI data set. So NeuroX will receive hundreds of thousands of scans from different neuroimaging sites across the world. And their job is to process the data set and objectively report some metrics, some results to the pharmaceutical companies. And then so for our goal here was to detect the MRI contrast, and a lot of times NeuroX will receive data from neuroimaging sites that's incorrectly labeled. So when they receive incorrectly labeled data, then it messes up the analysis, you get wrong results, and everything goes wrong. So for those of you who are not familiar what MRI contrast is, this is for part of the study, this is what we did. We wanted to identify these 5 different contrasts. So MRI can be used to image the brain, and by programming it in a different way, you can highlight different tissues accordingly. So for example, if you just focus on the bottom 2 images here, the proton density and the T2, you can see that different parts of the brain are showing up differently in the 2 images. And at the top here is the entire data set that we used. We had around 40,000 MRI data sets, and we divided into a training, validation, and testing data set. The training we used to optimize our parameters of the algorithm. The validation we used to assess the performance while we were training. And the testing we kept out completely separately so we can assess the performance of our algorithm at the end of the day. And so this is the architecture that we used for our study. It's very similar to the one I showed you before, the AlexNet. And so what I wanted to show here is that the input to the algorithm is a single slice of the MRI volume. And the data goes into the architecture, and the output of the architecture is a probability that this particular slice belongs to a particular category, in this case, T1 before contrast. And then in a similar way, we can do the same thing with other slices, proton density here. And then at the end of the day, we summarize all these results in this confusion matrix. So on the y-axis is the prediction as done by our algorithm, deep learning, and on the x-axis is the ground truth, the target modality. So if we look at the diagonal of the matrix, we see where the 2 are in agreement, and off diagonal is where the 2 are in disagreement. So we can summarize everything with the accuracy, which I'm showing up there. And so great. So next, what we did is we adapted this architecture to now detect the artifacts in MRI. So this is a study that's ongoing still. We're still working, and it's in collaboration with NeuroX. And now we are, instead of identifying the contrast, we want to identify the artifacts. So in a similar way as what I described earlier, if you have MR images that have artifacts in them, it can lead to type 1 error, it can lead to spurious results in the processing pipeline, it might detect a lesion that's not there. So in the study, what we did is we identified 3 different artifacts as defined using the standard by Loris. So I'm showing here just 3 images to illustrate what kind of artifact we might have. So the one that's labeled intensity up there is a signal dropout, possibly due to metallic implants. The motion is when the subject being scanned is moving around in the scanner. And then the coverage one is where the MR technician might have incorrectly placed the field of view, so then the top of the head or the cerebellum might get cut off. Another thing you might notice is that the number of data sets that we use here is much smaller than in the previous study, because we had one of our colleagues manually label each of the data sets. So we divided again in the training, validation, and testing, And I'll just go quickly because it's very similar to what I showed before, but you have now our architecture is working in 3D. So rather than feeding in a single slice, we are feeding the entire volume of the MRI. And again, the output is a probability that this MRI volume belongs to a specific category. So this case is identifying this volume as a intensity artifact or a motion artifact, and then this one as a coverage artifact. And again, we summarize the results with on the testing data set. And what we see is that, thank you, with this algorithm, we can, and on this data set, on this testing data set, we can detect whether or not an MRI has artifact with 100% accuracy, which is great. So if we take this to other databases and we're able to use this data set, this algorithm, to just filter out any problematic MRI volumes, then we can then reduce the number of volumes that we need to inspect. So if, however, if we break down this number 107 into the different categories that we were aiming to classify, we see that there's still room for improvement. So I just wanted to end by reiterating that deep learning is a very powerful tool that can be used. In this case, I talked about neuroimaging databases, but it can be used in different studies, with different data sets. I've described 2 studies that we've been working on where we detected the contrast of the MRI, and another one that's still ongoing, but we're looking to identify whether or not an MRI has artifacts and what type of artifacts. And so if you're interested in this type of work, I just wanted to let you know about this group that Arna Ghosh and I have recently started, where we're trying to learn how neuroscience and deep learning can help each other. So these artificial neural networks are biologically inspired neural networks. They're not exactly what's going on in the brain, but they're modeled after that. And so deep learning has a base in neuroscience. And now that deep learning has been developed, it's being applied, as I've showed you, in neuroscience. And now there's even more work where more advanced or more detailed neuroscience research is helping to develop deep learning even further. So if you're interested, check this out. And with that, I want to thank my collaborators, Setu, for helping me with the image artifact detection, and the collaborators at NeuroX. And I wanted to thank you for your attention.